A century and a half after she died, the story began again with a whisper and a smell. In the archives of the Cincinnati Museum Center, a conservator pulled open an old cedar chest sealed with brittle wax. The air that escaped was thick with mildew and something sweeter, almost like spoiled honey. Inside lay a child's torn dress, browned by time, wrapped around a rusted iron key tagged simply G, 1856. At first, the intern cataloging the item thought it belonged to a shipment of plantation relics, but the chest hid a name written in a trembling female hand on the lining. M. Garner. Two curators looked at one another with a quiet dread. That name still carried a curse in the Ohio River Valley, whispered when locals spoke of the ghost mother of Covington, of the cries that sometimes echoed down the water at night when a fog rolled in from the Kentucky banks. The documents began to surface one by one. Court transcripts, church letters, newspaper clippings that a post-war editor had stamped suppressed. They told of a winter flight through frozen fields, a desperate mother, and a death so unspeakable that even abolitionists hesitated to mention it aloud. In those fragile papers gleamed the secret America wanted to forget, how one woman trapped between bondage and freedom forced the country to face the true horror of slavery, not through rebellion, but through the love that destroyed her child rather than return it to chains. This was no folk tale. Her name was Margaret Garner, and what she did in the dim parlor of a Cincinnati house one frigid January day sent shockwaves from the Ohio River to the halls of Congress. It would inspire novels, riots, and sermons. Yet half of her truth was buried, her trial censored, her body lost, her memory sanitized until only shadow remained. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Garner and the secret America tried to erase, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. In the winter of 1856, Cincinnati was a city balanced on a fault line. Across the river stretched the slave state of Kentucky, its hills scorched with hemp farms and tobacco barns, where enslaved men and women trudged through frozen mud beside shuddering mules. North of the water lay Ohio, officially free but pulsing with contradictions. Abolitionist churches on one street, slave catchers lurking on the next. The Ohio River itself was the thinnest of borders, sometimes frozen solid, sometimes only a mile of ice-gray current separating freedom from servitude. The city smelled of coal smoke and tannery acid. Steamboat bells clanged through the fog, and cheap whiskey spilled from the saloons at the docks. In the mornings, smoke rose from foundries along the Mill Creek, and German bakers sold bread beside newly arrived Irish laborers who cursed the cold. On Market Street, preachers denounced the sin of slavery, while within earshot, agents of the Fugitive Slave Act boasted of bounties for human flesh. The law, passed 6 years earlier, ordered citizens to return any escaped enslaved person to their owner. North or south, it made no difference. So the nation's conscience trembled here, where the free soil men shared pews with copperheads, and the Underground Railroad ran beneath the tenements like a living vein. Every rumor of escape carried the weight of rebellion, every echo of pursuit the sound of justice, inverted. That January was particularly merciless. The river froze in plates of jagged glass. Women gathered scraps to feed pot-belly stoves. Children coughed in the coal dust. Through this bleak landscape trudged the Garner family, Margaret, her husband Robert, and their 4 small children, slipping across the frozen expanse from Boone County, Kentucky, toward Cincinnati's promise of liberty. In her pocket, Margaret carried a small tin brooch, a stolen trinket that once belonged to the master's wife. A symbol, perhaps, of vengeance or remembrance. But freedom in Cincinnati was a fiction written in delicate ink. Federal marshals prowled the streets, deputized by Southern claims of property. No black person, escaped or freeborn, could find peace. The city's press printed contradictory truths. Abolitionist papers like the Anti-Slavery Bugle demanded justice for the oppressed. Others thundered that the law was divine and slaves were the rightful chattel of their owners. Ministers debated scripture in packed chapels, Lutherans and Methodists quoting Exodus and Ephesians until the word of God came to sound like two opposing cries in the dark. At the city's edge stood Walnut Hills, its roads lined with bare orchards and crooked fences. In a small frame house along Mill Creek lived relatives of Margaret's, free people of color who risked their safety to shelter the family. That night, the Garners huddled inside, hearing only the groan of ice shifting on the river. For perhaps the first time, they believed they had survived the impossible. But the telegraph wires were quicker than hope. By dawn, the slave catchers had crossed the frozen river with the U.S. Deputy Marshal at their side, warrants drawn under the seal of the Fugitive Slave Act. Cincinnati's streets were slick with sleet as they surrounded the house. What happened inside would become one of the most terrible and revealing moments in American history, a tragedy that forced even hardened judges to look away. When the gunfire stopped, one child lay still inside that house. The others cried into the unforgiving silence. The public soon read fragments, just enough to ignite a furor. Yet even in that glare of outrage, something was missing. Evidence concealed, testimony erased, and behind it all, whispers of another hand guiding the cover-up, anxious to keep the true horror from staining the nation's conscience. The first testimonies place Margaret Garner as a woman of stern beauty, tall, with eyes the color of river mud, and a stillness that unsettled those unused to slaves who met their gaze. In Boone County, Kentucky, she belonged to Archibald Gaines, a prosperous farmer whose fields stretched to the horizon with hemp and rye. Gaines was no monster by local standards. He fancied himself a gentleman. Yet, as with so many patriarchs of that world, kindness was a mask worn over cruelty and contradiction. Half the county whispered the same rumor, that Margaret's youngest children bore the pale hue of their master. A surviving neighbor account describes an encounter one July afternoon. Gaines had summoned Margaret to the porch to take dictation for a list of supplies. She stood barefoot in the dust, head bent. "Girl," he said, the bourbon thick on his tongue, "you read my numbers wrong again." "No, sir," she replied softly, not meeting his eyes. "It's 12 bushels, not 10. You said so yester evening." The old man's smile faltered, a whipcord of temper tightening behind it. "You think too much, Margaret. A thinking slave's a dangerous thing." He turned away, but she held her ground. A witness swore she muttered something then. "Better to think and die free than live forever and forget my mind." It was seed and prophecy in one breath. Her husband, Robert Garner, was a man of broad shoulders and devout spirit, hired out by Gaines to a neighboring farm. He carried himself with the heavy silence of one accustomed to swallowing his anger. To neighbors, Robert was stubborn good stock, pious, industrious, but too proud to bow quickly enough. When Margaret spoke to him in the dark, they dreamed of Cincinnati, where word spread that colored men could earn wages and rent their own homes. It was a fragile hope, no more stable than the river ice that sometimes shimmered under the moon. Yet they believed. Their children, Thomas, Samuel, Mary, and the baby girl named Scylla, were the center of that dream. Margaret guarded them with a fierceness that even Gaines's wife, Mary Gaines, found unnerving. One diary fragment from that household reads, "I cannot abide the black woman's stare. She holds her babes as if we should steal them." Perhaps in that sentence lies the bitter irony of the century, that the enslaver's family feared theft of affection, even as they themselves trafficked in flesh and lineage. By the winter of 1855, the Garners had begun whispering of escape. The plan was reckless. Cross the frozen river by night, travel north through Cincinnati's black community, and reach one of the safe houses run by the anti-slavery clergy. They had heard of the Reverend John Rankin, The Presbyterian minister, whose lamp-stationed house on a cliff above Ripley had guided hundreds of fugitives through the years. Margaret's courage masked a biblical despair. Letters from abolitionist Lucy Stone, who later interviewed her in prison, described Margaret as a woman whose intellect outpaced her hope. During that conversation, Lucy wrote, "She told me, they call this place the land of the free, but I have never seen it. I would rather see my children die than taken south again. They are born people, not chattel." The house of Gaines grew thick with unease. Mrs. Gaines began to treat Margaret with forced civility, as if politeness could disguise suspicion. Meanwhile, Robert hoarded scraps of food, a small hatchet, and 2 quilts sewn by Margaret. Each stitch was a prayer to unknown gods, freedom's patchwork made tangible. One cold dusk, Margaret watched from the smokehouse window as snow began to fall on the fields. The scent of pork fat and burnt hickory filled the air. She whispered to Scylla, the baby on her hip, "We'll walk on white into the north." It was a dangerous poetry. To speak a dream aloud in that silence was to risk conjuring it. The Garner's journey became possible through another enslaved man, Simon, who had once ferried tobacco to the Cincinnati market by boat. Simon would become a ghost in court testimony, no one certain who paid him or if he survived. Witnesses would remember his nervous whisper to Robert, "The ice is thick enough, brother. The Lord done paved you a path." So one night the family slipped from the cabin, shoes wrapped in burlap to muffle steps. The wind scoured the terrain until the world itself moaned. Dogs howled downriver. As they reached the frozen Ohio, Margaret knelt and pressed her palm against the ice. It groaned, but held. Scylla whimpered from the cold. Robert lifted his son Thomas on his shoulders and said, "Don't look back, Margie. Ain't nothing there but death." She nodded, though tears burned her cheeks in the wind. Later testimonies from citizens of Covington recalled seeing 5 figures moving across the ice like dark wraiths, each carrying another life within them. One man described the sound of ice cracking underfoot as the hymn of Judgment Day. When the Garners reached the northern shore and stumbled toward Cincinnati's outskirts, the first light of dawn revealed a world both alien and tender. Margaret looked back once, the Kentucky hills shrouded in mist, and whispered, "So near hell stands heaven." Their refuge, a modest frame house belonging to the free black family, Eliza and Elijah Kite, sat near Mill Creek. It had once served as a station on the Underground Railroad, its cellar still lined with crates marked molasses that had hidden fugitives before them. There, for a single day, the Garners believed they might breathe as free souls. But freedom cast long shadows. In the city taverns, word already spread. A valuable family of slaves had vanished from Boone County, their master offering a rich reward. Gazette headlines spoke of Negro thieves crossing the frozen river and urged citizens to assist lawful officers in the slaves' recovery. Even many who opposed slavery still obeyed the letter of the law, fearing federal reprisal. That tension was everywhere, between compassion and compliance. On Sunday mornings, as bells tolled from church steeples, black congregants knelt beside white abolitionists, praying not only for deliverance but for the courage to disobey evil. Out on the streets, Irish immigrants, desperate for their own foothold in America, often aided marshals in exchange for coin, their red noses shining in the cold as they scanned alleys for runaways. And so, while Margaret soothed her children near a borrowed fire, forces of law and ownership conspired. A telegraph shuttled southwards. Fugitives located Cincinnati. Within hours, Deputy Marshal Jacob Kite, no relation to their hosts, rode across the river with Archibald Gaines and his armed men. They carried warrants under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, declaring the Garners mere property absconded from their rightful owner. To defy them was federal treason. Inside the hiding house, a neighbor, a washerwoman named Sarah Ward, heard the first knock that would echo through history. The clock had not yet struck 9. Sarah recounted years later, her voice brittle. It was a Sunday, quiet as a graveyard. Then came the boots on the boards and the cry, "Open in the name of the law." My front glass near shattered with it. Elijah Kite bolted the door and whispered, "Stay low." Robert grasped an axe handle. Margaret cradled Scylla against her breast. The eldest boy began to cry, but she hushed him with a sound so strange it silenced everyone. A moan, more animal than human, pulled from the deep pit of centuries. Outside, pistols cocked. The door splintered. No one could know, not even Margaret, what she would do in the next breath, or how that act would trample through America's conscience like a crack in the very stone of faith. Gunfire shattered the Sunday calm. The first bullet tore through the splintering door, lodging in the cedar frame above Margaret's head. Robert returned fire, one shot, loud enough to wake the neighborhood. Dog barks rose like alarms. Smoke filled the small parlor, acrid and greasy. Outside, the deputy shouted for men to swarm the windows. The air was suddenly alive with splinters, glass, and voices thick with fury. Neighbors later told reporters the fighting lasted only minutes, but to those inside, time fractured, agonizingly slow. Margaret dragged her children toward the back room where a single shuttered window let in faint light off the snow. She pressed them close, whispering in a fevered rhythm that half resembled prayer. When the men burst through the door, the smoke cleared just enough to frame a picture no painter could bear to finish. Margaret knelt on the floor, her arms bloodied, her dress dark where the child's body rested against her. The hatchet in her trembling hand glinted as an officer shouted, "For God's sake, woman, stop!" But she did not hear him. Behind her, Robert grappled with another intruder, both slipping on the slick floorboards. Outside, Mrs. Kite wailed. The lawmen seized the Garniers one by one. It was finished. That was the moment Cincinnati became divided not by the river, but by conscience. The baby, Scylla, was dead, her throat cut clean through. When Margaret was dragged to her feet, handcuffed and still weeping, she reportedly said to one astonished officer, "I killed my child so she would never know the whip." The marshal recoiled, muttering through pale lips, "Merciful God." But among the abolitionists who would soon crowd the courthouse, another sentiment flickered, that she had done with her own hands what America refused to do, end a child slavery by any means possible. The Garniers were marched through the freezing streets back to the riverfront. Crowds gathered, dock laborers, bakers, and housewives craning to see the woman with blood on her gown. A pale dawn reflected in the ice along the riverbank, turning the water crimson where it lapped against the ferry logs. Margaret's gaze was fixed somewhere no one else could see. A reporter from the Cincinnati Gazette wrote, "Her expression was neither despair nor madness, but an awful composure that froze the spirit of all who beheld her." Within hours, the Fugitive Slave Act had claimed them. They were confined first to a narrow cell in the city jail, while legal scholars and moralists prepared for war, not over bullets or ballots, but over the soul of a woman, and the definition of freedom itself. The first signs of horror spreading beyond that room came not from ghosts or curses, but from conversation. In parlors, people argued until voices cracked. Church bells tolled for Sunday services while congregants murmured about Mrs. Garner between hymns. Tavern men cursed her as a murderess. Abolitionist ministers hailed her as a martyr. That same day, Reverend John Rankin visited the jail to pray with her. His diary preserves their exchange. "Child," he said softly through the bars, "the Lord will forgive you, for you acted in bondage, not sin." Margaret's reply unsettled him all his days. "It was not his forgiveness I sought, Reverend, but his sight. If he sees what was done to us, maybe he'll judge America as he judged Egypt." Rankin wrote them later, Her voice was low, but I confess I trembled. I could not tell whether I spoke to a woman or to the wrath of God in flesh. Outside, the courthouse became a theater of moral conflict. Reporters arrived from Boston, New York, even London, drawn by the paradox. A slave charged both with murder and with theft of herself. On one side, pro-slavery men thundered that law must stand, that property could not be seized from rightful owners. On the other, abolitionists pleaded that no human should be a commodity, and that to kill rather than endure slavery was the natural assertion of the soul. The tension fed on itself. Each newspaper printed its own truth. The Inquirer called her act a savage revolt, proof of the Negro's unfitness for freedom. The Bugle answered with a headline that screamed, "Mother chooses liberty and death." Somewhere in the courthouse basement, constables mopped away water leaking from the pipes. They claimed sometimes they heard a child crying, though none were present. One insisted that Margaret hummed lullabies to the air, her fingers tracing invisible circles as though rocking the child still. These were whispered stories at the edge of fact, small rumors sprouting from grief and fear. Cincinnati was a city already haunted by guilt. Now the haunting became literal. On winter nights, water froze in new stalactites along the prison walls, shaped like delicate hands reaching downward. The guards swore the air carried the scent of iron and lilac, the same odor found in the house where the killing occurred. Across the river, Archibald Gaines returned to Boone County to collect documents proving ownership. He avoided speaking to the press, but a neighbor swore that the planter's house had grown strangely silent. The dogs refused to enter the parlor. Mrs. Gaines took ill and kept to her bed. At night, the master's study remained lit till dawn. The decanter half empty, papers spread like confessions he could not burn. One farmhand reported a moment a few nights after the killing. Gaines sat at the hearth, eyes bloodshot. The man asked if the master was all right. Gaines answered slowly, "I can still hear the ice breaking. I think it was her curse." He dismissed the servant and poured another drink. It was an unusual statement for a man of power in that era, admitting fear of a woman he claimed to own. Whether guilt or superstition haunted him, no one could tell. By the time he returned to Cincinnati for the trial, rumor painted him not as master, but as monster. Preachers suggested Margaret's violence was divine justice. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators held signs reading, "Let her testify," and "The babe is free." Inside, the proceedings began under Judge Pendery, a man bound more to paperwork than to ethics. The court smelled of damp wool and sweat, overfull with onlookers. Margaret sat pale and composed beside Robert. She was not permitted to speak except through counsel, but every gaze was drawn toward her. During recess, a jail matron would later recall whispering to her, "They mean to send you south again." Margaret said in answer, "Then I will finish what was left incomplete." The matron dared not ask her meaning. Late that night, an abolitionist journalist visited the jail and later wrote that an uncanny quiet hung over the building. Even the rats had ceased their motion, he penned. It was as if the structure itself held its breath. When he passed her cell, Margaret was awake, humming. The song was a tune none could identify, part spiritual, part wail. It was not melody, but lament made flesh. The journalist said he stepped closer until he heard words that chilled him. "Blood be the river, freedom the shore." He fled before she looked up. As winter slowly gave way to the early thaw, another unease settled on the town. On certain nights, the Ohio River appeared to glimmer red under the moon, as if spots of unseen rust rose from beneath the ice. People said it was the river remembering. And in that atmosphere, half panic, half reverence, the trial of Margaret Garner began. But few knew that greater horrors would emerge, not from what she did, but from what the nation did in response. How judges twisted scripture, how politicians silenced truth, and how America sealed away the evidence. The story that would echo through history had barely begun to unfold. The trial of Margaret Garner began on a bitter January morning in Cincinnati's federal courthouse, a brick structure crouched near the riverfront, its halls echoing with boots and whispers. The air was heavy with damp wool coats and the sharp tang of ink from the clerks' desks. No case like this had ever been seen before. A woman charged simultaneously under two nations of conscience, one legal, the other moral. Before the judge even entered, the crowd pressed so close that the constables used batons to hold back the surge. Pious matrons gripped their prayer books. Stevedores from the docks leaned on window ledges, craning for a glimpse. Newsboys hawked broadsheets outside, their calls muffled by the wind. The Garner woman arraigned, a slave's crime or a martyr's act. In the front row sat the attorneys who would shape history's language. On one side, J.J. Smith and John Jolliffe, abolitionist lawyers whose offices were rumored to double as underground railroad stations. On the other, Charles Torrance, defense counsel for Archibald Gaines, a man whose reputation for oratory could sway entire juries. Each represented not merely a client but an ideology, the eternal collision between ownership and humanity. When the judge, Levi Penderi, finally took his seat, he surveyed the room as if staring down two tempests. What he desired, above justice, was silence. What he received was outrage in three languages: legal, religious, and human. The opening motion came from Gaines's counsel, demanding the slaves' immediate return under the Fugitive Slave Act. "These are not citizens," Torrance announced, pounding the table. "They are chattels, runaway property belonging to Mr. Gaines of Boone County, Kentucky. We are here to reclaim what the Constitution declares his right." A hiss spread through the gallery. Then Jolliffe rose, slender and gray-eyed, his thin frame trembling only slightly. "Your Honor," he said, "we contend that no man owns another, nor any woman her children's despair." Penderi banged his gavel, but Jolliffe continued. "If the law demands this mother back into bondage, then it demands murder itself. For her act was the despair of bondage touching the innocent. The law claims her body. God may judge her soul." Behind the rail, Margaret sat motionless, her face a mask between defiance and exhaustion. Reporters compared her poise to a statue carved from the conscience of the nation. Robert, shackled beside her, bowed his head in silent prayer. For weeks, the courtroom became a fevered theater. Witnesses recounted the flight, the gunfire, the child's death. Each testimony ignited new factions in the galleries, some gasping in pity, others muttering "savage." The matron who guarded Margaret was reluctant, but compelled. She sat quiet most nights, but once, the woman faltered, she asked me if angels forgive mothers. I told her yes, and she smiled, but not kindly. Reporters scribbled furiously. The next morning, the Cincinnati Chronicle ran the line as headline, "The Murderess Smiles at God." Outside the courthouse, picketers multiplied. Methodist ministers held prayer circles, chanting hymns drowned by the jeers of pro-slavery mobs. Someone hung a crude sign on the courthouse gate, "Retribution comes north." Windows rattled as the mob threw stones that evening. Deputies sealed the doors, keeping the jury inside overnight. By lamplight, Penderi stared at the law books stacked before him, volumes that offered no guidance for judging a mother's mercy murder. And then, as he later told an acquaintance, something strange occurred. His candle guttered despite the absence of draft, and a child's faint cry echoed down the hall. He rose, thinking it a prank by clerks, yet the corridor lay empty. The sound reminded him of water dripping into a cistern. Thereafter, he refused to lock the courthouse alone after dark. The following day's testimony brought another fracture of fear. Gaines himself was called to the stand. He was paler than when he'd arrived in January, his once proud posture hunched. Jolliffe, calm as a blade, began the questioning. "Mr. Gaines," he said, "is it true that several of Mrs. Garner's children bore complexion lighter than your other slaves?" The courtroom inhaled as one. Gaines stammered, "I cannot say. The colored race mingles shades, sir, by nature." "Was it nature?" Jolliffe pressed softly. "Or your own trespass upon her person?" The gasp turned into a roar. Pendery slammed his gavel until silence regained the room. Gaines's face flushed like blood rising through snow. He muttered, "I'll not answer such indignity," and turned away. For the abolitionist press, that evasion was confession enough. The whisper spread. The dead child had been the master's daughter. Yet, officially, the court ignored the insinuation. To acknowledge it was to unravel the entire logic of slavery. If Margaret's children were half their master's blood, what then was the meaning of property? Could a man own the flesh of his own kin? In the courthouse corridors, journalists traded ghost stories between sessions. Some said they saw wet footprints appearing on the floor, though no one entered from outside. Others swore that in the dim hours before dawn, the scent of lilac, the flower Margaret once grew behind Gaines's house, clung to the stairwell. A deputy told his wife he heard whispering from the evidence chest containing the child's dress, as if fabric itself were trying to testify. She later urged him to quit his post or go mad. By mid-February, official Cincinnati resembled a haunted church. Every sermon, every headline, every casual conversation circled back to one question: was Margaret Garner evil or holy? Slave or mother? Criminal or prophet? When the jury retired to deliberate, snow began to fall again, heavy as ash. Outside, thousands gathered in the square, holding lanterns. Someone began to sing, "Let My People Go," the sound swelling through the streets until even the constables dared not silence it. Inside, hours passed. Finally, Pendery stepped out to announce that federal jurisdiction held. The Garners were property under the fugitive slave law and must be returned to Kentucky. The murder, if murder it was, did not belong to Ohio's courts, for under the Constitution, a slave could neither commit nor be tried for crime as a citizen. She would be judged not as a person, but as cargo. The crowd erupted. Cries of shame filled the room. Margaret rose to her feet, pale yet fierce. Over the din she shouted, "Then God will judge you all under his higher law." Guards dragged her out before Pendery could respond. An abolitionist journalist recorded the scene. In that instant she ceased to be a live woman and became legend. What followed was quieter, but even darker. The Garners were transported under heavy guard to Covington, set to be returned to their master's estate. Yet abolitionists in Cincinnati, unwilling to surrender, filed emergency appeals. Newspapers reported that crowds lined the ferry docks, throwing flowers and scarves in the family's path, while children sang hymns about the promised land. Soldiers raised rifles to keep order. The ferryman later confessed that as the boat reached mid-river, the same stretch where they had once crossed to freedom, he thought he saw cracks spidering through the ice in the distance, though the weather had softened days before. It looked, he said, like the river was remembering the blood. Robert, manacled beside his wife, murmured Psalm 23 under his breath. Margaret whispered nothing. Witnesses swore her face was calm, but her eyes fixed on the Kentucky shore with a dread so profound it stilled even the guards. When they docked, Gaines's overseer greeted them. He avoided looking at the covered bundle they brought, the dead child, preserved as evidence. He simply tipped his hat, muttering, "Best get her home, sir." But everyone on that deck knew home was a graveyard. As paperwork dragged on, the Garniers remained confined temporarily in a warehouse converted to holding cells. There, abolitionist Lucy Stone visited once more. Her private letter describes the encounter. She was gaunt but unbroken. The chains could not contain her will. She said to me quietly, "They call it mercy," I showed her. "I call it promise kept." When I begged her to sleep, she added, "I dream she plays on clear water, not this one of mud." I could not speak, for it seemed she spoke beyond life and into eternity. The following night, lightning split the sky over the river. A steamboat called Henry Louis, moored nearby for transport, caught fire in the storm, its hull gleaming like iron set alight. Dozens saw flames reflected on the waves, spreading outward in eerie symmetry. Some said the blaze formed the silhouette of a woman kneeling with a child in her arms. Superstition conquered reason that night. The story spread that the river itself mourned or avenged something human words could not contain. Old rivermen muttered prayers before every new voyage. Within days, another legal twist came. Rather than face Kentucky law directly, the family was sold farther south to recoup costs, the greatest cruelty imaginable. They boarded a steamboat bound for New Orleans, shackles glinting under gray daylight. Margaret held no child then, only silence. Witnesses recorded that as the boat pulled out, she stared upriver toward Cincinnati and whispered a line no one could quite catch. Some heard, "The Lord will find me." Others claimed it was, "I'll find the river again." Either way, the town never slept easily after she was gone. By spring, the court records were sealed, some documents curiously missing: the child's dress, one testimony, and a page from Pendery's own notes. Rumors accused officials of erasure, of burying shame beneath bureaucratic ash. To admit the story's full truth would demand that America stared directly at itself. But a few scraps endured. A tattered letter, a pressed lilac petal found years later between Bible pages, the faint engraving on a cell wall, "Better death than chains." Whether carved by Margaret or another prisoner, none could tell. But those words became gospel among the abolitionists who kept her name alive as both warning and prayer. What happened next? How the South consumed her. How whispers turned her into myth, and how even writers and preachers tried to reshape or erase her memory, would reveal the final horror. Not only her fate, but what a nation chose to forget. The steamboat Henry Louis churned southward through the March fog, her paddle wheels slicing the river with a noise like slow thunder. Chains clinked in rhythm to the engine's pulse. Margaret sat below deck, locked among a handful of other captives whose eyes had already turned glassy from resignation. Above them, deckhands sang work songs that no longer sounded human, words lost in steam and sorrow. Somewhere beyond those red iron walls, cold rain blurred the banks of Kentucky and Tennessee into one gray smear. America was melting together and tearing apart at the same time. The crewmen avoided looking at her. One, a white youth with freckled cheeks, said afterward that when he passed the hold, the air turned suddenly cold, as if the furnace of hell itself had gone out. Margaret sat upright, head bowed, lips moving in steady cadence. He thought she prayed. Then he heard it, the faintest hum, the same eerie lullaby later remembered by guards in Cincinnati. He fled without finishing his rounds. Northbound pilgrims told a darker version, that the ghost of her murdered child glided alongside in the fog all the way downriver, pale veil trailing like torn silk across the water. Yet, in the court of history, superstition only ever echoed truth in disguise. That mist may simply have been steam, and yet grief has its own physics. What it imagines, it summons. 3 days later, disaster struck. Near Louisville, another vessel, the Telegraph, approached from the south, its captain ignoring warning bells. Both captains misjudged the current. The two steamboats collided with a screech of wood and iron that split the dawn. Fire blossomed instantly, spreading from oily rigging into the cargo hold. Flames leapt like tongues devouring sky. Passengers screamed above the roar of escaping steam. When the smoke cleared hours